Welcome to Atlas Explained, where every border carries a hidden story. Florida was not taken in a war that Americans remember. It was taken in a war Spain could no longer afford to fight. In the spring of 1818, an American general crossed an international border without a declaration of war. His name was Andrew Jackson. He led more than 3,000 regular troops and militia into Spanish territory under the claim of restoring order along the frontier. Within weeks, Spanish forts fell, flags were lowered, and men acting under Spanish authority were arrested or executed. The land he entered did not belong to the United States. It belonged to Spain. 3 years later, Spain would sign papers surrendering it without receiving a single dollar. Jackson did not march into empty wilderness. He advanced along narrow coastal corridors that controlled access to Pensacola Bay and the Gulf sea lanes leading toward Cuba. The forts he seized were often guarded by fewer than 50 Spanish soldiers. In some years, payroll ships arrived months late. Entire garrisons went unpaid, undersupplied, and isolated. Florida had never been built to resist this kind of pressure. It was not designed to grow into a prosperous colony. It existed as a forward watchtower placed to guard the approaches to the Caribbean. Its settlements were sparse, its economy negligible, and its civilian population thinly scattered across marshland and pine forests. Florida was meant to delay threats, not to defeat them. For Spain, the Caribbean was the core of its American empire. Havana and Veracruz anchored the flow of silver, food, and fleets that sustained imperial power. Florida's forts were never meant to enrich the crown. They were meant to protect what truly mattered. This narrow function shaped Florida's entire existence. Few families were encouraged to settle there. Local food production remained weak. In some districts, fewer than a dozen civilian households supported entire garrisons. Reinforcements from Havana could take weeks to arrive, even in favorable weather. Florida could not sustain itself. It could not raise revenue. It could not rebuild defenses after disruption. Its survival depended entirely on the strength of Spain's wider empire. As long as Spain remained strong, Florida could remain weak. By the early 19th century, that balance was breaking. European wars were draining Spanish finances. Its navy was shrinking. The empire that Florida depended on was losing the ability to maintain its outermost defenses. When Andrew Jackson crossed into Spanish territory, he was not attacking a strong frontier. He was stepping into a wall that had already begun to crumble. Florida's weakness did not originate on its own frontier. It was created in distant royal courts and European war rooms that reshaped North America without ever setting foot on its soil. Spain's presence north of the Caribbean was never the result of a deliberate plan to build a continental empire. Much of it arrived through diplomatic inheritance rather than conquest. After the 7 Years' War, France quietly transferred Louisiana to Spanish control. The territory was not meant to become a thriving colony. It was designed as a geopolitical buffer. Its purpose was to block British expansion and keep rival powers at a distance from the Caribbean heartland. Together, Louisiana and Florida formed a wide belt of uncertainty meant to absorb pressure before it could reach Havana, Veracruz, and Mexico City. Spain governed this buffer lightly. Settlement was slow. Infrastructure was thin. Roads between forts were scarce, and river routes often served as the only reliable connections. The system relied on ambiguity rather than strength. Distance, uncertainty, and diplomatic hesitation were expected to deter intrusion more effectively than armies. Florida made sense within this arrangement. Its weakness was not a failure. It was the accepted cost of holding a much larger defensive perimeter. The watchtower did not need to be strong as long as the wall behind it remained intact. That wall collapsed under Napoleon Bonaparte. When he forced Spain to return Louisiana to France and then sold it to the United States, the entire defensive geometry of Spain's North American holdings disappeared almost overnight. A buffer that had taken decades to assemble vanished in a single transaction. Florida was suddenly no longer distant. It now stood beside a growing republic whose political culture was turning decisively toward expansion. What had once been a remote frontier became a shared border. Spain still claimed Florida in law, but the system that had once made that claim enforceable no longer existed. The disappearance of Spain's buffer zone transformed Florida's strategic meaning almost immediately. What had once been a remote military outpost now bordered a republic whose population was growing rapidly and whose political leadership increasingly viewed territorial expansion as essential to national security. The United States no longer treated Western growth as an option. It was becoming a policy expectation. Florida's geography made it impossible to ignore. Its coastline stretched along the Gulf of Mexico, guarding shipping routes that connected American ports to the wider Atlantic world. Its harbors offered natural anchorages that could serve both commercial and military fleets. In American strategic thinking, Florida appeared less like a foreign colony and more like an unresolved vulnerability. Spain understood this danger. Its officials repeatedly rejected American offers to purchase the territory. Even weakened Madrid could not willingly surrender a position that still protected Cuba and the Caribbean trade network. Florida remained a defensive anchor in theory, even as its practical defenses eroded. While diplomats negotiated, settlers moved. American families crossed informal boundaries into West Florida, clearing land that was Spanish in law but thinly governed in practice. These communities traded northward, relied on American courts, and gradually detached from Spanish administrative life. Florida's population began to change faster than its borders. Authority followed daily habits rather than legal claims. The peninsula was becoming culturally American before it became politically American. Spain still owned Florida on paper, but on the ground control was beginning to slip. By the second decade of the 19th century, Florida had become less a colony than a contested corridor. Spanish officials remained in their posts, but their authority no longer matched the reality on the ground. Trade moved north into American markets. Settlers appealed to American courts. Spanish law increasingly existed only where it could still be enforced by a small and overstretched garrison. In Washington, Florida was no longer treated as a distant diplomatic question. It was discussed as a practical security problem. Its harbors and coastline were viewed as potential entry points for foreign powers, and as safe havens for groups that crossed into American territory. Florida had become a gap in the nation's defensive perimeter. Andrew Jackson emerged as the instrument of that new security logic. He was not simply a frontier general. He represented how American expansion was now being enforced. When raids and unrest intensified along the border, Jackson was given wide discretion to stabilize the region. His mission was framed narrowly, but his actions would prove decisive. Jackson entered Spanish Florida under the justification of restoring order. He seized forts, removed Spanish officials, and asserted American control over strategic points. The moves were bold, legally ambiguous, and impossible for Spain to counter in practice. What had been creeping influence became open administration. Florida was no longer slipping away quietly. It was being taken in plain view. Andrew Jackson did not enter a strong frontier. He entered a territory that Spain could no longer meaningfully defend. Florida's coastline stretched for more than 1,000 miles, yet Spain maintained fewer than 2,000 soldiers scattered across its forts, ports, and inland posts. Against this thin defensive line, Jackson advanced with more than 3,000 American regulars and militia supported by settlers, who already treated much of the region as American land. His campaign moved along narrow river routes and coastal roads that connected the peninsula's main defensive points. Fort San Marcos at St. Mark's fell quickly. Pensacola, the administrative heart of Spanish Florida, was seized soon afterward. These were not symbolic victories. They controlled access to the Gulf routes that linked Florida to Cuba and the Caribbean. Jackson's orders were limited to suppressing raids and restoring order. In practice, his actions dismantled what remained of Spanish governance. Forts were seized. Officials were removed. American flags replaced Spanish banners without formal declarations of war. These actions did not introduce American authority. They revealed it. Trade had already shifted north. Courts had already begun resolving disputes under American law. Settlers had already begun appealing to American protection. Jackson's army made visible a transformation that had been unfolding quietly for years. Spain protested through diplomatic channels, but it lacked the capacity to respond. The empire was fighting to retain entire viceroyalties elsewhere. There were no spare armies to deploy, no fleets to send, and no financial reserves to sustain a prolonged confrontation over a colony that produced little and demanded constant support. By the end of Jackson's campaign, Florida's sovereignty had thinned into legal formality. On the ground, American administration had replaced Spanish governance across much of the peninsula. The First Seminole War did not redirect Florida's fate. It confirmed it. What had been creeping absorption hardened into formal occupation. American patrols operated freely across the peninsula. Supply lines, courts, and administrative routines replaced Spanish systems that no longer functioned. The imbalance of force made resistance unrealistic. A coastline stretching over 1,000 miles could not be secured by fewer than 2,000 scattered soldiers, especially against a republic whose frontier armies could mobilize larger forces with speed. Spanish garrisons were isolated, underfunded, and cut off from reliable reinforcement. Florida now existed as an American territory in practice, even while it remained Spanish in treaty language. The question of control had already been settled through daily administration rather than formal agreements. Spain faced a narrowing choice. It could allow Florida to continue slipping away without formal settlement, or it could negotiate terms that fixed borders and preserved what little leverage remained elsewhere in its shrinking empire. The loss itself was no longer in doubt. Only its legal recording remained. While Florida was being overtaken along its northern edge, Spain's empire was unraveling across an entire hemisphere. What had once been a unified imperial system was fragmenting under the combined pressure of war, financial exhaustion, and independence movements that spread far beyond any single frontier. Every crisis elsewhere reduced the resources that Florida depended on to remain defensible. Mexico was in open rebellion. South American territories were breaking away. Royal treasuries were depleted, and the Atlantic fleet was shrinking. Each uprising south of the Rio Grande drained the men, ships, and money that Florida needed simply to keep its thin line of forts supplied and manned. While Mexico burned Florida became a burden Madrid could no longer carry. The colony produced little revenue, demanded constant military support, and offered no decisive leverage in the struggle to preserve the empire's core territories. Holding it competed directly with defending entire viceroyalties that were still worth saving. Spanish officials began to see Florida not as a shield, but as a liability. It had become an exposed edge that demanded resources Spain could no longer spare. Spain was no longer choosing whether Florida would be lost. It was choosing how the loss would be recorded. By the late 1810s, Florida had already slipped beyond Spain's ability to reclaim it by force. American troops administered much of the territory, and Spanish authority survived largely in legal language rather than in practical governance. What remained was no longer a military problem. It was a diplomatic reckoning. In Washington, the task of formalizing Florida's absorption fell to Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. He understood that the territory was already American in practice. His objective was not simply to acquire Florida, but to fix borders, eliminate European claims along the southern frontier, and transform an unstable occupation into recognized sovereignty. In Madrid, King Ferdinand VII faced a narrowing set of choices. His empire was fighting to contain revolutions across the Americas, its treasury was depleted, and its fleets were shrinking. Florida demanded troops and money Spain no longer possessed. Adams's terms were not attractive, but they reflected a reality Spain could not reverse. The Adams-Onis Treaty did not record a negotiation between equals. It formalized a forced decision. Spain relinquished Florida in exchange for defined borders that secured what little it still hoped to preserve in the Southwest. The agreement transformed an uncontrolled loss into a managed retreat. Florida was no longer contested. What had been absorbed in practice was now secured in law. Spain signed away a territory it no longer had the strength to hold. But this was not just a victory for the United States. For Spain, it was a desperate gamble that would soon collapse in ways no one in Madrid had anticipated. The treaty made Florida's transfer appear deceptively simple. No money changed hands. No ceremonial exchange of wealth followed the signatures. On the surface, Spain seemed to surrender a province for nothing. But beneath that simplicity lay a narrowing field of choices. By relinquishing Florida, Spain reduced the number of vulnerable fronts it was expected to defend. The colony demanded constant military support while offering little economic return. Its coastline alone required ships and garrisons that Madrid could no longer afford to maintain. In return for surrendering Florida, Spain gained defined borders that it believed could still be defended. For the United States, the agreement secured a continuous southern frontier and removed a European power from the Gulf Coast. For Spain, it marked a strategic contraction. Territory was abandoned so that what remained could be more tightly controlled. The price of Florida was not measured in money. It was measured in priorities. Spain abandoned an exposed edge in order to preserve the legal integrity of its shrinking imperial core. The treaty was meant to draw a final defensive line. Spain's gamble did not succeed. The defensive line it drew with the Adams-Onis Treaty proved to be temporary rather than permanent. Within only a few years, much of Spain's remaining American empire would fracture into independent nations. Mexico broke away. Central America followed. South American viceroyalties collapsed into new republics. The borders Spain had hoped to secure shifted again, and the empire's defensive perimeter continued to contract. Florida's transfer revealed what the treaty could not prevent. The loss of the peninsula was not an isolated concession. It was the first visible crack in a retreat that would soon spread across an entire hemisphere. What had once guarded the approaches to the Caribbean had become an exposed edge that Spain no longer had the strength to hold. Florida was not relinquished because it lacked value. It was relinquished because the empire behind it no longer had the capacity to defend its outer walls. By the time the treaty was signed, Florida had already ceased to belong to Spain in every practical sense. The paper only recorded what history had already decided.